Welcome everybody to a exciting conversation today. My name is Jessica. I'm here from Behold Retreats and I'm interviewing Gemini Adams. Gemini is a trauma recovery specialist. She's a therapist and she trains other people in trauma recovery. So train the trainer. We've got an expert for you here today, and she's also a facilitator for ayahuasca. So she's got both that traditional space and the, what would we say? I was going to say non-traditional, but I think there's a better word for it, maybe cultural, shamanistic aspects to healing. So bringing both of those to the space to talk about healing today, healing and trauma.
Thank you, Jess. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm very excited about this collaboration, and more importantly, the weaving together of what you just mentioned, which is the sort of ancient approach to healing, the indigenous approach, right, which we're all becoming so intrigued by in the Western world, and then how that can be married together with these more psychiatric based and psychological based trauma therapies to really integrate that work in a way that really helps bring us home to who we truly are, and the benefit of working with those as a sort of marriage in unison, and how they both have different qualities. And very excited too to share my own experiences of working in both of those spaces, both personally and professionally.
Fabulous. Well, I thought a really good place to start would be trauma is a big buzzword today. What's the best way that you use to understand or to describe or to think about trauma?
Sure. Trauma is a big word, right? It applies to so many things in our lives, and yet so many of us kind of spend our life pretending that we never had any trauma. So the word itself can be very activating, right?
I can feel it in my body,
Exactly.
even when we were saying that at the beginning.
Yeah. And, one of the things that's actually interesting through the indigenous lens is that Western culture itself is a trauma. Because we have been so disconnected from our relationship to the earth, from relationship to community, and actually really disconnected from each other. So we might not perhaps put that in the box of trauma as in big trauma, you went off to the battlefield and came home shell-shocked, or that, you had something really catastrophic happen, like you got caught in a tsunami or some other natural disaster. So much of trauma is actually something that happens very subtly over a period of time and very consistently. And so the actual definition that we work with as trauma therapists, particularly trauma therapists who really understand the impact of trauma on the body or our capacity for embodiment and our nervous system, and how that affects our ability to be our optimal self, both in terms of relational opportunity, capacity, but also our physical health, our emotional health, our mental health. And so the definition given to what is traumatic is anything that is both overwhelming to your nervous system and something that you feel you cannot escape from. So when you look at it through that lens, it becomes very different, because it's not something, often people come to me and they're, minimizing their traumas. Well, I didn't have a big trauma, I wasn't abused, I didn't get beaten, but it can be the absence of something that can also be traumatic. So emotional neglect in our homes, which actually is overwhelming to the nervous system of a very, very small child, because they don't know how to manage their emotions at that state. They need, the parent to come in and soothe and co-regulate them. So the reason for me, or the reason I see that trauma as a word is activating, is because we associate it with something very big and dramatic. And where trauma actually kind of creeps up on us and causes all sorts of interesting discombobulations in our life is when it's happened more subtly within our family of origins, right? where there's been an absence of deep emotional relating, or there's been something more on the spectrum of actual neglect, or there's just been a lack of modelling of what healthy relating even looks like. And as a consequence of that, we sort of run around feeling like there's something missing inside of us, or we're trying to fill that with, substances or work or some other dynamic. And it's only when we start to recognise, okay, this was actually a form of trauma that I was experiencing, that we can really begin to go about correcting that and rebuilding our own ability for relationship in a different way.
Yeah, I'm feeling all of what you just shared, and there's so many things are coming to mind. I think one of the really interesting ones is you touched on the, like, in our family of origin, when a healthy relating model isn't modeled, healthy relating isn't modeled. Like, I think back to my family, and anytime like that comes up, I always kind of have this thing where I want to say, but my parents were great. and then I also think about, well, what about their parents? Like, they didn't have healthy relating modeled to them, so where were they going to learn it? Like, of course they weren't able to pass that on to me. Like, we have wars in our background, and forced migration and things like that, and I can imagine that, like, when they'd experienced the big traumas and they lose their capacity to give that into their family, like, it just kind of compounds. And now I almost feel like I get the chance to shift that, and help renegotiate it. But
absolutely, yeah. And this is something I see a lot of in my private practice, which is, the recognition that most of us in the West, our parents appeared to be great in the context that we had. Yes. Nice homes, we had good education provided to us or financed by them. Our what appeared to be our basic needs were taken care of. And if you go and compare yourself to, a child growing up in a developing country, you're like, how could I possibly think there was anything wrong? And yet there's still something.
Yeah.
And exactly what you're describing, which we now know is what's called epigenetic trauma, which is the trauma gets handed down through our DNA. And when there's been an absence of resource, of support at some part of the family constellation, that just spills down the family line. And so, a big part, something we'll be working with in the Evolve retreat, is the reparation of ancestral trauma too. Because one of the ways we work is to bring resourcing back into our lives. Where is the support missing that would actually enable us to feel more capable of relating, connecting, and that's great. We can learn those skill sets, but if it's still missing from our ancestors 2-3 generations back, it's not actually going to fully stick in us. So we have to look at the fact that we are not individual beings despite our individually oriented culture. We're part of a family mechanism that extends far beyond us, right? So, working with modalities like family constellation really seeks to acknowledge and honour that and bring in the resource to support the whole system.
Family, the piece around family constellation and being connected, I think, is a really interesting one, because so often we grow up being taught to be really responsible, especially as women as well. It's like, well, we're in women's empowerment, it's important to be strong, to be capable, to be independent. And I think sometimes we forget about that balance. And I think for men too, that's a lot of the traditional conditioning. It's like, don't feel, be the provider, you have to be strong. Like, men get shamed for experiencing or expressing emotion a lot of the time. And so it makes a lot of sense to me to think about it in connection with other people. Like, what am I allowed to feel and express? What are you allowed to feel and express? How do we all come to a place where we get to be in ourselves and not be worrying anymore about what's happening in the connection space?
Yeah, and just to reflect on that, one of the things I see a lot in our modern culture is over independence, right? There's a term that some people may be familiar with, which is codependent. And there's a lot of actually what's called counter dependence in our modern day relationships, where we've oriented ourselves so much to, I'm okay all by myself, I can take on the world, I can go and live in another country, I can set up 10 businesses, I'm fine. But the truth is we're not fine. We are intimately oriented, community oriented beings. It is wired into our nervous system and our DNA. And this is something I've definitely seen play out a lot during COVID, where people were actually forced into isolation and to go inward. And the kind of one of the biggest, most consistent reflections is people suddenly realizing, oh, I need people. I need support. I need to relate. And oftentimes we just have things that are in the way of that because we've had experiences that were painful in relationships. So we struggle to trust that that's really going to be there. Or we don't know how to ask directly. And we have no idea how to even identify our own needs to then communicate them to another. So it's much safer, or it feels safer, to stay in that interdependence rather than to kind of really look at coming into intimacy and connection. And one of the kind of more classic responses that happens in relationship is the codependent one, where you make your whole life about someone. But often the other is where you're operating in that I don't really need anyone, I'm just fine. And so, or you can actually oscillate between the two. 1 minute you're codependent, and then you go into counter-dependent, which is obviously very confusing for someone you might be in a relationship with. And this doesn't actually only show up in our romantic relationships. It also shows up in our relationships with our colleagues and our friends, and where we might appear on the doorstep, in floods of tears, help, I'm struggling with this part of my life, and then they go to reach out, and you're nowhere to be seen because you're kind of off on a big mission. So it's really inviting us to look at what are the patterns within ourselves that have got set up in our family of origins, and they've become our coping mechanisms for keeping parts of us safe and protected in the event that we might come back into a dynamic where it's too painful, right? These are all protective mechanisms, and so really we meet those with deep compassion because they're there for a reason, right? We don't want to go and poke them or even try and rip them away. It's really coming into compassionate understanding that this is really a cultural thing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that there's no one individual really that I see who has excelled in this, because our whole culture has been transformed in part through modernization, capitalism, the orientation away from families of origin, extended family members, village, tribal settings, into living by yourself in a uptown apartment block overlooking the pier, which looks great on the outside, but there's often this deep loneliness within, because actually we're removed from what it is that actually nourishes us and feeds us at the deepest level.
And I also really heard before when you were saying when we are removed, we're not just removed from others, but we're often removed from ourselves. Like if we don't know what we need, how can we ask for it? And then even when we do know what we need, if we don't feel that the other is going to provide it, or if we feel that there'll be negative consequences of asking, like how do we move into a space where we can regain our voice? I think a lot of it can also come down to a loss of voice and a loss of knowing our needs. And for me, I've certainly seen as we start to tap back in, as we start to build those skills, like that's when connection starts again. But it's scary, like it's
terrifying.
It's like it's not an easy process. It's not something I think we can do alone, because as we start to approach these places, it's like you said, the protection is there for a reason. It's not like we're trying to go in and be like, that part's bad, take it away, that part's bad, take it away. It's like honoring what's present and finding the way to allow that to relax so that something new can come through. It's a lot of what I was hearing you share just then.
Yeah, and to build on that, the trauma response I touched on earlier, one of the ways that you typically hear that described is the fight, flight, freeze response, which is what is happening in our nervous system. And essentially we can, that's a system of gears that our bodies should be able to maneuver through, just the same way you do with a gear shift in a car, right? And in an optimal dynamic, you just, switch gears, first to fifth, depending on what you're doing. But sometimes we can get stuck in first gear, which, if anybody's ever got stuck in first gear, is a very painful way to drive, let alone live your life. Similarly, if you're stuck in fifth gear and you suddenly come to the top of a hill and you've got to get down the other side, that's going to be terrifying. There is another gear. There's another component of the nervous system response that often gets developed from particularly trauma that has happened in early childhood, whereby, if you have a parent who is perhaps very volatile, whether that be emotionally or the way that they communicate verbally, and it's called the fawn response. And the fawn response is where we essentially collapse our needs in favour of behaving in a way that we know is going to mitigate any response from the other. So it's a survival mechanism that is coming out of our fight response, fear. But it's how we orient then the way that we treat others. So we can become very people-pleasing. We can become very conflict avoidant. We can become... we sort of, camouflage ourselves to fit in with what other people want so that we're not, going to maybe press their buttons. And that might be extremely effective when you're 5 years old, and you're trying to stop the parent from blowing a gasket. But if you are still operating that way in your 30s and 40s, it's going to have a huge and unhealthy impact on your own body, on your own ability to relate, because ultimately it's an inauthentic way of relating. It's a survival strategy that has got way out of control. And most of us have no idea how to undo that. It's not something that we can necessarily do just from, for example, working with plant medicine or psychedelics, because it has to happen in relationship. I often reflect that my personal experience, and I've seen this in the hundreds of ceremonies I've sat in and facilitation around it, that plant medicine is brilliant for defragging our system, for, bringing up, for us to have to see the parts of us that we've sort of been going, I don't need to go there. But the integration, that the work to bring in new software, to enable us to repair or add in the education that we failed to get in our families of origin, doesn't happen through the plants. We have to engage in learning new relational skills. We have to find those parts of us that are still, sitting there in terror going, no, I'm not going to speak up because it's going to create conflict, right? And it's extremely vulnerable. And not when it's held in the right way, when we're shown how to actually dialogue with those parts of ourselves, how to meet those parts of ourselves within, and ask in a way that isn't going to completely trigger and activate our partner or our boss. And it's really a very specific skill set. And so, it's one of the things I love to do with people, because it's really growing people up from wounded child into healthy adult. And the beauty of that is, the world will shift as we get more people, not wandering around looking like adults on the outside, but acting from our 5-year-old wounded parts inside, but really aligning those so we get to be whole, truly in the truest meaning of the word.
That sounds fantastic. Which I think brings up an interesting question. So if people are listening to this and wondering, how much am I in my wounded child, how much am I in my adult, like what am I feeling into here, what am I seeing here for myself. How can people know if maybe they're in their wounded child? How can they know if this might be a situation that's true for them?
Well, for sure, if you feel yourself going into tantrums with your partner or your colleagues, then that's definitely a very evident sign.
Maybe define tantrums.
Yeah. Becoming, very loud or very verbally aggressive, or literally stomping your feet on the floor. So, becoming very activated and triggered, right? And I guess a really good way to describe it is, we know when we're in a healthy adult, right? We're calm. We can remain what is technically called regulated. We have control over our emotions. They might become a little intensified, but we can still be with those and still relate. When we switch into wounded child, it is literally like our healthy adult self just poofs up somewhere into his space. I don't know, there's some like healthy adult hangout in the metaverse or something that everyone goes to, and we are literally flooded. We're flooded by this young part that cannot see reason anymore, cannot articulate clearly or safely, and will go into blame and accusation or a rage response, or become hysterical, right? That is not safe, healthy relating. And that part then may go to another coping mechanism when the other person has run away from us, because that's terrifying, or we've run away because we're terrified of the way we're behaving, for example, and then we go into some other kind of coping strategy, eating, television, some kind of ism, in order to manage the distress, because there is distress within that, right? Because we know that that's not a healthy way to relate. But it doesn't always have to look that dramatic. There are other ways that we may find that we've gone into a wounded child. We can be very impulsive, right? We might just jump into relationships or business agreements or choices without being able to kind of really check in with ourselves in an embodied way to determine, is this really for me? So we lack the discernment process.
It's kind of just wanting to get that decision done. It's
well,
like
it feels comfortable. Children just, children are impulsive. They don't use mind, body, heart to make decisions. They leap into something, and the parents are like, "Oh no, what are they doing?" Right? So
don't touch the stove.
Exactly. It's a dynamic of self-abandonment.
I understand.
And when you're a healthy adult, you really deeply check in with self before you do things. You look and measure and assess and filter. Whether it's a date or a business deal. And you learn also to trust your embodied self, to learn if you're really in consent. Whereas when you're coming from a wounded child response, you will leap from the frying pan into the fire, and your friends and family members and maybe colleagues will all be sitting there rolling their eyes like, oh God, she's doing this again.
Why that sort of man?
and also, and then on the other side of it, there's usually a period of shame. Like, wow, I cannot believe I did that again. Like, what is wrong with me? I'm an intelligent being. I've got this degree. I went to this university. I should know better. And the truth is, you should. But when you're being hijacked by a young part of yourself in that way, it's deeply frustrating, because you are literally like, where did I go? Who made that choice? So it's an unconscious abandonment of self, and it's part of also what's called a repetition compulsion, where there's a part of us that is trying to work out that trauma response, but we just don't actually have the tools or the awareness to grow into that healthy adult. And another way that we can be acting from that child response is, again, it's a form of self-abandonment, but we might go into rescuing others. So we unconsciously seek out people that are also in wounded child, except when we come in and try to help them, we look like we're in a healthy adult.
Right.
Because we're coming in as the saviour to support them, whether that be financially or with a listening ear, or navigating them into a new professional or something, but actually we're abandoning our own needs. We're directing all of our energy to them, and it's because actually underneath some part of us also wants to be saved. So we project that and direct it to another person, but it's still coming from wounded child versus the healthy adult. And usually those relationships get a little bit sticky at some point in time as well.
Because it's still relating at the child dynamic. Absolutely. Rather than the adult dynamic.
Yeah.
And it's interesting around that, what you're talking about around that it's like, well, my adult self, if I was in my adult self, I would know how to deal with this, but the child's coming in and needing the skills to be able to honor and allow the child to kind of, recognize first.
For themselves.
Yeah, it's like...
and grow and identify what they need versus us being like, oh, you need this, and bringing all sorts of things in. It's also there's a piece in there too around boundaries, and this is another core part of wounded child. When children, watch them, boundaries don't really exist for small children. And not understanding boundaries is core part of wounded child behaviour, right? And that may mean that we unconsciously trample on other people's boundaries, or it may mean that we have no boundaries and other people trample on ours, or we may get into very wishy-washy boundary dynamics with others where resentment builds up, or perceived persecution because no one's really clear on what's happening. And so that also plays a part in that, when we're rescuing others, we may be oblivious to the fact that they have boundaries that really we should be acknowledging and respecting. So it's, a lot of this stuff is happening for all of us every day. We don't necessarily have the language for it, right? We're maybe not calling it that because we don't have the lens through which I'm seeing this through. But we just know that things become icky in those dynamics with others, and that there's a part of us that may just feel embarrassed, like we know deep down that the way we just handled that interaction or that relationship, that we could do so much better, but we just don't know how.
I'm thinking of all sorts of examples in my head of where some of these are coming in. Yeah, right. I think there's some really interesting ones in the workplace as well, because as you're saying, I can hear a lot in personal relationship, but then if thinking about the workplace, like with COVID and suddenly working from home, like boundaries, how do we be more conscious about boundaries and not end up just working really long hours because suddenly the move to or from the office has changed? And I think it was a very similar conversation to when mobile phones started coming in and emails were coming into our phone after hours. Like it's interesting how
absolutely
boundaries and the whole culture's moving in the same time, and that pressure as well. Like you're saying, like how does healthy relating look like, and how does our boundary look like? It can feel a bit threatening to put in a boundary and say I don't respond to emails after 6:00. Like I am not available for work meetings when I have to put the kids to bed because I'm in a COVID situation and someone needs to put them to bed.
It's family time, right?
Yeah.
And what's tricky is it's very difficult for us to perhaps ask for that and hold our boundary if we grew up in a household where that wasn't modeled to us.
Yeah.
And it feeds exploitation.
Yeah.
Because, there's that, perhaps you have a boss who has that expectation because they don't honour or value those things or have boundaries themselves, and you feel yourself going into people pleaser mode because it's the boss and the fears that might be around that. And so cultivating consent within those dynamics and boundaries is a very clean way to engage in our relationships, to build safety, to build whole relationships with each other.
And I think you're touching on something as well that's really really interesting, which is around as leaders or as someone who's stepping into a space and willing to set a boundary, whether we're in an official leadership position or not, that becomes an act of leadership, that when we can be in our adult and start to use these skills, the culture of a workplace or the tenor of the relationship can change, because we're taking it into a more mature space, like a space where we can honor ourselves. Like, I've seen different teams responding differently to these times, and some having conversations about, what does it mean, what do you guys need, what is it going to look like, and they have conversations together. And teams where it's a little bit more fragmented, and those conversations are not happening, so it's up to the individual. And I think it's really interesting around the relating style, and like, what do we want to do, what do we want to offer as someone who might be in a position to affect other people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, as you pointed out at the beginning, I run trainings with other providers, right? Other practitioners, therapists, teachers, facilitators, and one of the things I see a lot in the arena of sort of wellness and health and well-being is, our own relating style has a huge impact on how we hold space. And hold space is definitely a term that's used in the wellness world, but actually every manager, every boss, every parent is holding space. You either are consciously creating a container for the interactions that you have, or there is no container. And when there is no container, things get messy. When you start out by setting clear intentions with each other and agreements, and also even looking at, well, what do we do if one of us gets dysregulated, if one of us drops into that place? How do we support each other? Because so much of the work of healing our relational traumas is in building repair when there's been rupture. It's in supporting each other through direct communication and co-regulation. These are, again, quite technical terms, but really being able to address, how something has impacted us and what we need in response to that to repair the situation, rather than just subversively, going into resentment or passive-aggressive responses, or, secretly in our heads plotting how we're going to, take out our boss or leave, right, and go to the competing company.
Oh, God.
And we're all guilty, right? We're all guilty of doing this stuff. But we can do better.
Yeah.
We can do so much better. And the truth is that there are very few places to learn these skill sets, right? We all know it somewhere inside ourselves. I was just talking with a colleague today, and we were both sharing, wow, our education system is such a failure.
Oh.
Right? Relationship is the foundation of every single thing we do, every interaction we have. Business isn't about just joining widgets together, right? That comes through the way that we relate, right? We might be good negotiators, or, we might have a really passionate romantic relationship, but when it comes to the actual nitty-gritty of relating around difficult topics, it's going to fall apart if we don't have those skills. And so, it's fascinating to me that we don't actually get taught these types of things within our education system.
Yeah.
The world would look radically different. And so, what I see is that for those of us who have a deeper call, who recognize that we're here perhaps to really bring resolution to the generations of trauma in our own families, or we're here as agents of change to, plant seeds, not just for within our own lives, but for our organizations or our communities, whatever it is that we're part of, influencing, that is our responsibility. It's a deep soul call to step into, creating a really new earth, a new way of being. And, I always find it really interesting, this idea of peace, world peace, and everybody wants world peace. It is not out there. It's in here, and how we learn to relate in ways that bring peace into our human relationships. And the more of us that really come into that space and gain this skill set, ultimately that will, become the tipping point. It will spill out into, our organizations or our families and grow. And, so for me, this work, and, this is a journey I've obviously been on myself. I didn't just read a bunch of books. It's really been a deep call. I grew up in a home with a lot of relational trauma, surprise, surprise, and did not have any of these tools to work with myself. And so, a combination of different therapeutic interventions that I experienced and worked with plant medicine, and really growing up those parts of me that had no clue, right? I knew something was wrong. I knew that I wasn't able to kind of connect in the way I really deeply wanted to. And, you know, and I see the impact of that. I see the impact of that in my own organisation, in the spaces that I create as a provider, a retreat facilitator. And, you know, I also see the effect of that on colleagues and participants. And it's really beautiful to witness. You know, it's a timely thing as well in terms of what I think we all see happening in our world, right? We thought we'd learned some of these big lessons around, you know, wars in Europe, and suddenly we're in a domain again where it's like, wow, okay, we're back here again? How? You know, we're all seeking some kind of consciousness shift. Except it's not just something that is ethereal in terms of, oh wow, I've now elevated into some other spiritual domain. The work is here. How do we actually stay in grounded, heartfelt connection and relationship, compassionately recognizing that there are parts of us that are going to respond from pain from the past? And how do we meet that in each other in a way where we can actually dissolve those responses and come really into deeper union?
It's really beautiful. The piece that very much jumped out at me when you were talking about that as well is just that the word crave. Like we crave that connection. We crave, like there's to be able to be in right relationship, and to know how to come into that. And when we don't have the skills, when we haven't, it can feel like there's something wrong, there's something missing. Is there something wrong with me? Is there something that I'm just not doing? Like, how do I fix or change myself or contort in a different way or tell someone else to do something different? And it's not about that. It's just about really allowing that dropping in and that allowing of the moving into a space with new skills and a new type of honoring of self.
I think it also requires a lot of self-honesty. You know, I touched
damn self-honesty
at the beginning on the fact that you know, often people who find their way into my private practice are, you know, spent many years on the path of healing, done, you know, many ceremonies or been to many different therapists, taken a gazillion yoga classes and breathwork experiences and gone to festivals and you know, been trying really hard, right? And or they've been in denial and dismissing that anything bad ever really happened, and yet they found themselves in another really horrifically toxic relational dynamic, and it has pushed them to the edge, and they're like, okay, I get it, I have to do something. I can't keep blaming the other here. There is something in me that is drawing in these, you know, same dynamics on repeat. But once we're in that place, we don't need to know the solution. If we're in a place of self-admission, of being able to identify, wow, there is some part of me here that really needs tending to, that doesn't know, right? And it's very painful to admit that sometimes, because I think the difference is it's very interesting and easy to think we can learn something just purely as content, as knowledge. And for sure, in the way that I work with people, we, you know, add a lot of intellectual research and information in, particularly because the mind is often our greatest protector, and it wants to think that it, you know, once it's got the information, everything will change. But actually, we have to work with the whole relational system. And that is not just through the mind, it's through the body's sort of danger detection mechanism and safety detection mechanism and the nervous system. And in being able to incrementally build new experience, new evidence of, oh, actually, well, I did try asking for my need and something different actually happened, right? And not asking for the need in a way you might have done previously, which is, you know, stomping your feet on the floor and throwing all the toys out the pram, but vulnerably asking from a place of connection to those authentic parts of self. And you have, and you can, in my experience, only really create that level of repair when that's happening in the context of safe relationship with a guide, whether that be in a retreat setting or in private one-on-one sessions. Which is why we're here.
Yes. As I say, I think it might be really interesting to talk a little bit about some of the changes and some of the results that you see, both in doing a therapeutic model in private practice, or in a more intensive model like an event, something like Evolve, which is the retreat that Gemini will be leading for us. Coming up in May, which, if you're curious, we'll talk to you a little bit more about at the end. But doing something like this, therapy or an intensive week-long retreat like Evolve, what are the sort of results that you see?
Sure, I can speak to both, right? So for me, the difference of coming together in community to do this work, albeit that can be very confronting. Because we can feel like, well, I do not want to share, the parts of me that I feel embarrassed by, or to let people know that, that I'm not relating in the way that I would like to be, right? That's a very vulnerable thing to admit to. But the beauty of coming together into a space like this, as a group, is actually that it's the recognizing through the process that we are so not alone, that we all struggle with this. So there's a sort of normalization that takes place, and there's a beautiful camaraderie that takes place as well. And certainly, when there are sharings, because a lot of the time we're just doing the work in pairs or small groups, we also get to witness each other in growth, which provides hope and inspiration and a sense of like, wow, okay, if they can have that result, then I can get that too. So there's a sort of double benefit happening there. And also it's a lot of fun. I know we're talking about trauma and all this stuff that sounds painful at some level. But there are studies which also show that when we learn something through play, we retain that much more than when we learn it kind of in a slow, boring way. So, that the whole week is actually oriented also around learning through, experiences that are joyful and playful and fun, as much as they are deeply kind of rewiring our whole system.
So it's not just a week of kind of sitting there doing the hard slog.
No, it is not. It's not a week of deep shadow work, even though oftentimes this stuff is in our shadow.
Yeah.
But no, it's it's done through the lens of the medicine wheel of the four winds. So we're working through also the recognition that some of this stuff we can't see. We don't know where it's coming from. It may not be from us. It could be from Aunt Flo 3 generations back, who felt so abandoned that this is still impacting the way that you show up in the world. So working with these indigenous practices allows us to kind of acknowledge what might be there in the unseen, to bring, as I mentioned, resourcing into the whole. And that is very beautiful sacred work, actually. We're working with ritual and practice, but we're also working with movement and inner child reparenting work, which is fun because it's inner child, and sure, the inner child might be a bit upset, but the minute you resource them, they become light and playful, and we have a lot of fun with that too.
Beautiful.
So that for me is the benefit, and something that is often reflected back. And probably the most consistent thing in group dynamics of this work is people recognizing and understanding themselves fully for the first time in their lives.
Wow. I'd like to just pause us there for a minute, because that's huge. Like you were talking about self-honesty being a really important precursor to being able to do this work, and then to dropping into a deep understanding of who we are. Like that's really big.
Yeah. And also recognizing that depth of compassion and seeing that in others, right? So my experience is that the group experiences therefore help us to go back into the world and really see others through the lens of actually being trauma aware, right? So, you know, I will often get messages from people, wow, I see my boss in a completely different light now.
Yeah.
Because I can see why he's dysregulating. You know, how his own childhood trauma might be impacting his ability to be the person. And then it gets tricky, right? Because then we want to try and fix, or we want to try and give unsolicited advice. And,
to our boss.
We speak to that at the end. But it really does create a different relational capacity. And then we can make choices as to whether or not we want to stay in relationship to those people, or we want to find some people who've, you know, perhaps done some growth work too. The difference for me between that and the individual work, one-on-one, is that, you know, it's a deep dive, right, for, you know, 7 days together. And, you know, there is some beauty about how those communities form and evolve when you come together and stay in connection afterwards. So there's a sort of continuum that happens. The one-on-one work, in a way, you know, we inch through because, you know, it's usually an hour at a time, so it takes many months, right, to get the same level of download in terms of understanding yourself. Because, you know, I think total, we worked out what it was like 60 hours total for the retreat. Yeah. So you're really coming into 60 hours worth of therapy. You know, that's more than a year if you're going 1 hour a week. So if you look at it that way, sure, you can do that work. And of course, it's very much, when it's one-on-one, we're also working with parts that may feel very unsafe coming into a relationship. And that can be overwhelming if you're in a group setting, although obviously I do a lot to create safe space. So it's, for sure, it's a little bit more tailored sometimes in the one-on-one realm. And for some people, that suits them better because of their own fear of vulnerability. And where I tend to find, you know, the work is particularly beneficial one-on-one is when someone is actually caught in a very deeply ingrained pattern around toxic relationship. So there's a lot of work to do to sort of extract the person from the dynamics that they've already built around themselves. Yeah. But really, the value is there in both. It you know, and one doesn't cancel out the other, right? You can do one-on-one work and then take a deep dive and find, oh wow, all of that stuff that got put in place, now I've really like taken it to another level. Yeah. And also the other way around, you can come in, you know, and do a deep dive and like, whoa, there's a whole other realm of possibility that could exist for me, and then realize on the other side of that, but there's some pieces here I really need help with still, right? Yeah. You know, particularly if you're in a strong pattern of fawn response, right? It takes time to inch our way out of that. So they're definitely not mutually exclusive. And they both have a time and a place. And, you know, sometimes, even in my private practice, there's a sort of pause. Like somebody will come and do a couple of months' work. They'll take off somewhere. Maybe they'll go and do a plant medicine journey or, I don't know, dance retreat or something, and come back having seen both how much they've grown and where they're experiencing what we call post-traumatic growth.
Right, yes.
And the shimmers of that. And also where they're going, oh, wow, this part is still really, really challenging for me, and I see myself still ignoring red flags, going into relationships, and I can see this part now needs to be worked on. So it's why it's like, you know, it's what's the word I'm looking for? Slow, incremental change.
Beautiful.
Whether it's in retreat or one-on-one.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think also sometimes our personality might dictate which one we kind of feel a bit more drawn to. Like the idea of doing massive breakthroughs, or the idea of kind of doing the inching through the water so that we can be comfortable. I can see how actually both can also feel good, just depending on where you're at the time.
Yeah, and also our availability. You know, sometimes all we can do is, wow, I can take out a week. Yeah. You know, but actually my lifestyle is such that trying to get to an appointment every week is just impossible. Yeah. And I do see value though in creating a container like that for a week, because we don't have, all the distractions of home. I used to work in a Center for Relational Healing in Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a pretty intense city, and by the time someone has like schlepped an hour drive across town from their kids' soccer practice, landed in the room, and you've got them grounded and present in a 60-minute session, you're really maybe only getting 30 minutes of real work in that space. And then they're like, oh no, I've got this other thing to go to. So it's sometimes super challenging to really carve out the real time that's needed for that rewiring and spaciousness, to have the epiphanies, the self-reflection, if we're just doing week to week. Where I work here in Thailand, a lot of people come, but they're in a sort of semi-vacation or sabbatical period, so they have the spaciousness still because they're not in their other life, and sometimes we have to create that. We have to say, I need to go away and really give myself the gift of time to allow myself to evolve. I really hear that.
I've done both. And there was something about being able to breathe when I'm taking time out of my corporate schedule, and I'm like, no, I'm just not available for this chunk of time. Like, I'm only available for myself. Like that level of solid boundary, you almost never get that. And so it can be quite amazing just even to have that experience of being this time is for me, and I'm really going to honor that and move into growth.
And I want to speak to that actually in the context of the way that we designed the retreat. I'm really into designing experiences for people in a way that is both going to obviously shake things up a little bit, but also really provide quality time for integration and reflection. And sometimes you go away on these things and it's just like schedule is packed. That does not create time for reflection and integration, and also relationship to form with the people that you're on the journey with. So we've really created a container here where there is like a good chunk of time every afternoon and a few evenings of the week too, to allow more of those nuggets of wisdom and reflection to come to the surface, to give you space to really be with all parts of you. For exactly that reason, your life schedule may be just so full outside that there's no opportunity for that, and it's a big part of the journey actually.
And to build on that, that's the other reason that we've been looking at. We're very careful to look at a location that it has the nature, it has that space where you can choose to come in and really be present and be totally taken care of, and be in this beautiful environment with the ocean and the sounds of that, and just being able to fully relax, to let everything go as deep as possible, and just be really held. Like you were touching on held space earlier, and there's the held space of someone being present and allowing their attention to wrap you, and then there's the held space of the attention is wrapping you and the environment is wrapping you, and you've got this beautiful space to literally just let go to a deeper level than is possible anywhere else, because everything is being held for you.
And also we, again, plenty of science behind how nature helps us to restore, right? It lowers our heart rate, blood pressure. It literally brings our, cellular mechanisms back into right relationship. And oftentimes, and I think this is a very key piece, it's when I made the reference earlier to indigenous culture and our Western culture, where they are in relationship to the earth in a way that we literally cannot even conceive. It's such a different worldview that when we actually get to be in nature, we start to kind of remember, and healing our relationship to this home, planet Earth, is often impossible when we have unresolved trauma that happened in our family of origin, happened in our own home. So it creates this disconnect to relationship to the earth, to relationship to nature. So by stepping into a container like this and working around like what might be there that we are conscious of or not, in the environment of, you know, really deeply being invited back into nature and to cultivate our relationship to nature. Not, you know, we're not going to go and start digging around in the ground, but we have got some juicy experiences, right, where we will go into places that support that. I'm not going to give too much away, but it's my experiences, you know, also through the shamanic lens I work with sometimes. It's unbelievably potent because it's something beyond our own perception, and working really with the magic of the land where we find ourselves. And Thailand is a extremely beautiful place, and not just in visual beauty, but in the sense of, you know, the waters are so warm and nourishing, and the space just, yes, I think the great word you use is it holds you in a really profound way, which is one of the reasons I chose to kind of set up my centre on this side of the world, because I see that. I see how the environment holds people.
That's really beautiful.
Yeah.
I'd like to also touch on a little bit about, so we're talking about the shamanic container and talking about kind of the different layers of being. Like we've got the physical selves, we've got the spiritual self, we've got the connection to nature, we've got all of those different, the emotional layer, we've got all these different parts. And coming into right relationship and connecting with them, I could really see, like, the first time when I went and sat with ayahuasca, I really didn't understand very much what was happening.
Does anyone?
I mean, it's certainly an experience that it's not until afterwards you're like, whoa, okay. Yeah. But it was also that sense of, you know, how do I connect to the spirit of what's happening? How do I... like the shamans who are present have quite a different worldview. How do I understand what I'm coming into? A lot of what we're talking about here, I would have loved to have had to get a sense of how do I set myself up and how do I embrace the journey? Like, I still feel that certainly at that time, I don't think my relationship with the medicine when I was sitting, like I didn't know how to relate to the medicine as much, and so I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on using this as a way to, if someone's wanting to do sit with plant medicine, whether it's ayahuasca or other psychedelics, is this something that is beneficial to prepare the way for something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the beautiful aspects for me of plant medicine, irrespective of where it's being facilitated, is that it can reconnect you deeply to your emotional body and your soul purpose. In fact, that is the purpose. When the shamans are working on you, that's their purpose. You know, they use this phrase all the time, limpia, limpia, limpia your corazon, you know, limpia alma. It's like clean the heart, clean the emotional body, clean the soul, right? Because we're souls trying to embody into these crazy physical manifestations. And most of us are stuck. Most of us have got a lot of cobwebs inside ourselves. And so we don't grow up in a culture generally where that's where we're oriented to, right? We're not oriented to how do I embody my soul essence fully and become the fullest expression of that, right? How do I get the right career that's going to, you know, give me financial stability, or how can I, you know, our system isn't so oriented towards that. So, and one of the ways that we can really develop our ability to ascertain internally with ourselves what is right for us, right? Not here. The mind is a terrible place to figure out whether or not something is right for you. But it's how most of us have been taught. We're taught to analyse at an intellectual level. And yet, actually, what we know through polyvagal theory is that the body is what detects whether or not something is right for us. It's a gut. And so in this work, we're learning how to relate to our somatic selves. We're learning how to come into embodied awareness. Each day we're working with practices that do that allow us to communicate with ourselves in a different way. But that's exactly the same way that you would communicate with a medicine if you were to go into journey. It's somatically, not intellectually. And a lot of people say, yeah, I think I'm embodied, which tells me straight away that there is no embodiment, because it's not something we think our way into. It is an embodied experience. And a lot of times when people go into medicine for the first time, they're shaking, they're having tremors, obviously urging. It's to clear out what is in the physical body to allow you to become embodied. And that can be blockages from both, toxins, so the sort of detoxification process, but also to feel again, because so many of us are numb. And not just numb in one place, but often in multiple places. And so learning how to work with that, right? Learning how to work with the fact that you might be sitting in a hut in the Amazon jungle with, like, how the hell did I end up here? With, a grandmother sitting there, waving some sage or a rattle, chanting songs that you don't understand. It's quite activating, right? But you would know how to then ground, how to resource yourself, how to stay present, even when the medicine journey gets difficult. And truth be told, it doesn't matter whether you're in a medicine journey or you're sitting with your boss who's suddenly getting slightly into a conflict mode with you. It's exactly the same response that we're working with, so that same skill set is being cultivated through this retreat. And another element that I think is really valuable, and why for this we're marrying together not just therapeutic process and new skill set, but also working through the lens of the medicine wheel, is to acknowledge that those practices, of which we're mostly working, that come from Peru, so despacho ceremony and medicine wheels, are long time tested practices that recognize that there are influences impacting us in the unseen. So there may be an abortion that happened either in your own lifetime or by your parents, and that child who was never acknowledged in the family system is actually causing havoc in the family dynamic that exists, or in your ability to have relationship. And so those are the kind of things that we might be shown in a plant medicine ceremony, but equally we could be shown that through the family constellation work that we're doing as part of this retreat. So I think it's expanding our awareness and our consciousness to recognize, as the indigenous peoples do, that we cannot know everything at the level of the mind, right? And yet we live in a educated society.
Educated.
That, is constantly letting us think that, well, yeah, I read it all in the newspaper, in the book, and I know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But that we can't. There's just so much more than this, I call them our ant brains, can really fully comprehend. And so beginning to open your consciousness to that in a gentle way, right? It's not being forced open because you're in an ayahuasca ceremony and suddenly you sort of see everything that exists in the beyond that you can't see in your waking reality. It's a sort of gentle bringing in new possibility around that, and a learning that maybe our Western way isn't the only way, and that actually the real beauty might be if we marry together indigenous wisdom with Western knowledge and use that as a lens through which we experience the rest of our lives.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm feeling your passion, and I'm feeling the beautiful marriage of those two in this conversation as well. I'm getting a lot of a sense of that, just kind of the possibility and the scope for healing and coming into being in that space where we can be in that adult decision making that can involve like the whole system, and be really present, and be able to lead ourselves and lead others and tap into connection as well.
Exactly, right. Relationship.
Yeah.
Doesn't always look like what we might think it is, right? Yeah.
I guess in many ways, as we start to tap into truths, we get to decide what it looks like for us.
Yeah.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
I'm going to wrap us here, and if you guys have loved Gemini as much as I love speaking to Gemini every time I've got to, as we've been planning and designing and getting ready for Evolve Retreat for you, we've been having a few of these conversations, and I'm always left with like a little piece of opening in my heart.
New possibility.
My
favourite word. Yeah. It's about creating little sparkles of new possibility. Yeah.
So you can get a ginormous dose of Gemini if you would like it. Come and
60 plus hours.
Jump into the spring. In where we have Evolve Retreat running in May, from the 1st to the 8th of May. We'll drop a link to that in the notes if you would love to join. And in the meantime, if they want to get a little bit more of you, Gemini, where should they have a look? Where would you like to direct them?
So there's 2 places online. One is my website, which is GeminiAdams.com, spelt like the zodiac sign. It is not a hippie name I was given. It is authentically my birth name, just to be clear. And also medium.com. I frequently write articles there around these topics. So there's a lot of long form content there too, that you can go and explore.
So if you want a little bit more head, they're the places. If you want some body, come to Evolve in May.
We look forward to seeing you there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you.
Yeah.